My name is Brad Mickley. I run the product management team for the DevTools group within Red Hat. I've actually only been at Red Hat for about 8 months, maybe 9. I actually came in through the CodeEnvy acquisition. So CodeEnvy was a startup focused on building a container-native IDE based on the Eclipse Che open source project, which CodeEnvy actually donated to the Eclipse Foundation. So for me, I actually started my career with developer tools, in fact. When I was in my 20s some time ago, I started with a little company based in Toronto, which is where I'm from, that was building at the time custom JVMs so that you could do memory analysis, heap analysis, and then profiling. This was before JVMs had all the nice instrumentation that they have now. So I started off writing papers about parallel versus concurrent GCs and weird stuff like that. Since then, I've kind of moved into broader and broader roles, but I really am happiest in the developer tool world. So I want to talk today about a number of trends that are happening. And I think probably as we go through these, there's going to be a few of them you guys are going to go, yeah, okay, you don't get any points for that one. It's pretty obvious. Some of them are maybe a little less obvious. And what I hope happens here is that by pulling them all together, there are some conclusions that maybe wouldn't be so obvious as you look at the individual piece parts. Because that's usually the way we absorb news, right, is kind of bit by bit. And sometimes you need a moment to step back and kind of see how it's all shaping up. So we'll start with something which I think is probably pretty obvious, something which makes me very happy, certainly, is that developers have the power of choice now. If you throw your mind back 20 years, it wasn't like that. Typically, developers used in the company whatever they were told to use. And if they didn't like it, they could leave the company. That doesn't happen very much anymore. There are still certain places, especially in secure environments, where that maybe is still the standard. But typically, developers have a fair bit of choice over what their tool set is. But it goes beyond that now. So it kind of first moved into that. OK, well, you can choose your own tools. But then this stuff over here is production, and you don't get to talk about that. You don't get to think about that. We'll think about that. We're the business. We're IT. You're just developers. We got this covered. Don't worry. But in fact, that's changing. And I think this is very powerful and very important. There was a survey done by Evans Data at the middle of last year, I'd say. And it showed that almost 60% rather, of developers believe that they are the primary decision maker of a cloud platform in their company. Primary decision maker. Less than 20% said they had little to no influence. So that's an enormous amount of power in the hands of developers. And that is the way it should be, because the platform is there to run the apps, and the apps are what the developers build. So it doesn't make sense to say, we're going to choose the platform and you can't, Mr. Developer, because you don't count. It's the apps that matter. It's not the platform that matters. And hopefully no one from Red Hat throws anything too big at me for saying that. But it's not, I'm joking, of course, everyone in Red Hat would agree with that. So that's great. So developers have gotten some power, they've gotten some, chutzpah, and they're starting to make the demands. But that's not the only thing that's changed. Development itself has changed. And this is where I think things get really interesting. One of the obvious ones, polyglot is now the norm. So 40% of enterprise developers are already using greater than 3 languages in their day-to-day development. That doesn't seem that big a deal. Like we're like, OK, well, of course. But again, throw your mind back 20 years, and we described ourselves as, I'm a Java developer. Oh, I'm a .NET developer. Oh, I'm a C++ guy. We didn't say like, hey, I'm a polyglot developer. I do whatever it takes. That didn't happen. So this actually is a change. And I'll talk about how this has affected tooling in a little bit. Containers are winning. And I think this is a big one as well. Obviously, probably most of you are here because you understand containers are winning. Red Hat certainly is very committed to that. But it's really changed the dynamic, I think, and will continue to change the dynamic of development. Because developers, again, historically, were very, and have been very attached to their machine. And if I chose Mac, it kind of singled me out as different than if she chose Linux, than if he chose Windows. That was something we talked about a lot, yelled at, And that doesn't necessarily happen the same way with containers, because a container is a container is a container. I can run it on this, you can run it on that, she can run it on the other. And then moving to the cloud. Now, this one, it's the fine print that's important. This is not saying that companies are moving to the cloud or apps are moving to the cloud. We all know that part. The part that was more striking is that 90% of developers believe their company will move their development entirely to the cloud in the next 3 years. That's a huge number and not a very long time frame. Now, the fine print on that is that cloud in this sense doesn't mean necessarily just public SaaS, okay? This could be a private cloud, internal, behind the firewall. The point is this starts to kind of throw light on the fact that the developers are not going to be developing in the same way, with the same tools, on the same machines as they have been for the last 30 years. So, if all of this stuff is changing and there's all this swirling going on, what are some of the things that we in Red Hat, within the Dev Tools group, what are we betting on? When I sit down with my product managers and we talk about where we need to go, what are some of the things that we say, these are the big bets. These are the things that we believe are going to happen, and because we believe those are going to happen, it makes these next decisions for our products self-evident, okay? The first, and kind of starts easy, containers will be the atomic unit of app execution. The assumption will be that by default, apps go into containers. Okay, that doesn't mean every app goes in a container. Doesn't mean there are no apps anywhere else. I'm not going to suggest that. But what it does mean is that increasingly as we move forward in time, I believe that the type of applications which cannot be or will not be containerized will begin to be looked on the way we look on a mainframe app today. That's highly specialized, it's not worth moving, it does its job, it's over there. And then we work over here. And the we work over here is the part that's going to be in the containers. Now, the only exception to this are serverless functions. And I think serverless is going to be a big, big impact on developers. You know, huge, potentially, impact on developers. Partly for the fact that common utilities just naturally seem to fall into this category per you know, consumptive services. But also, within the world of containers and microservices, we're really at the very beginning of this journey, okay? When I talk to most organizations about their new microservices application, typically those applications are still composed of a very small number of microservices. And they're really not super micro. They're kind of macro microservices. And that's okay. That's the way things start. We go from the monolith to a few chunks, to a few more chunks, to many, many, many chunks, right? But if you kind of pull that forward, you're like, okay, so my monolith got split into 3, then into 13, then into 30. At some point, like you just go, why don't I just pull out a bunch of the functions and make them serverless, and then I don't need to worry about it. The other side effect of this is that where today a developer has to be fairly aware of what their runtime is, because they have to install it on their machine. They have to update it as it changes all the time. In that future, they don't. They don't need to be. It doesn't mean that they won't. You know, imagine a lot of you in this room, by selection bias, self-selection, are here because you are interested in Kubernetes. You are interested in OpenShift. You are interested in how these things work under the hood. But not everyone is. There's a lot of developers, and they are good developers, who are just like, I don't really care if my app runs in a VM or runs in a container or, you know, runs on Grandma's 386. Doesn't matter. Does it run? Is it my code? That's all I care about. So as you start to read this forward, you realize that you're going to start to look for development tools which don't force a developer to be always under the hood. Now, if the way we develop is changing, and if the types of apps we're building are changing, then it falls naturally out of that the tool chain we use will have to change, okay? Now, this one's interesting to me because the tool chain will change, but at the same time, I believe it's going to become standardized and commoditized. And the Agile part of this, to me, is maybe the easiest one to explain, although it may be the most controversial, so that's why I chose it. Most companies I visit do Agile. They all do Agile a little bit differently. And I don't think it's actually because every company needs to do Agile a little bit differently. I think it's because the tool chain and the processes were built with Agile at a time before Agile was ubiquitous, before there was the ability to talk to 100 other companies about how they do Agile and learn together about the best way to do it. And so if you live in a closed room, you're going to invent something that looks a little different than the guy in the next closed room. So what I see, though, is that the job of babysitting these tool chains within an organization is an increasingly low-value job. It doesn't really move your business forward. It prevents your business from falling backwards, is really all it comes down to. The analogy I'll use is it's like a CRM system. Again, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, everybody had their own CRM system, and you ran it, and that's what you did. Same with ERP systems, same with help desk systems. All these things, you just ran them, you had to. And then comes along Salesforce, and then comes along ServiceNow. There is nobody who's running their own CRM system now. Like, they just use what's there because it has become sufficiently expert and sufficiently standardized that I get no business benefit out of having some unique CRM solution that I wouldn't get from just using Salesforce. I think you're going to start seeing that same thing happen to the developer toolchain. Now, and that kind of, have led you here already, but what that kind of leads to is this belief that if you're going to start standardizing and if you're going to focus your resources on things which are going to have a high value for your organization as opposed to the plumbing, let's call it, then it makes sense that plumbing will move up into the cloud, will be made available as SaaS, and you will simply consume it the way you do Salesforce.com or ServiceNow. Now, talked a little bit about this, but let's drill into it a little bit deeper. We believe that it is going to be unusual, increasingly unusual, for a developer to install stuff on their local machine. There's a lot of reasons for that. So on one hand, it's just a kind of math problem, a velocity problem. Because if I have a team of 14 people, and every one of those 14 people has to install something locally, and every time there's a change in the runtime, all 14 people have to expend the time to update it and check it and share it and make sure that they're not on the different version, and oh shoot, I forgot to do that one, or I pulled down the wrong dependency, or oh, you pulled your dependency from there, I pulled it from here. These problems actually, although each one individually takes a very small amount of time to fix, as you sum them across a team, as you sum them across an organization, the impact becomes larger and larger and larger. When we were Code Envy, we measured this at a number of our customers, and we found that on average, it ran between 15 and 24% of the team's weekly time was spent on some number of these maintenance-y tasks. That's a non-trivial number. I mean, 5% I wouldn't be super thrilled with, but even a low end, 15%, that's ugly. That's a lot of potential business benefit being wasted on the wrong things. So that's the velocity and the agility. What about security? Well, today, I clone my source code locally to this laptop. If anybody has ever had an IT role where they had to try and secure devices, or if you've ever talked to anybody who has, you will know that this is a very difficult device to secure. Way more difficult than an OpenShift cluster in your central IT or in a cloud. And then, it gets worse and worse and worse from there. So if you have the ability to allow developers to work seamlessly with source code in a way which is natural and enjoyable for them, but where that source code can be housed internally on a secured system and not brought onto an easy-to-lose device, then you win. And there's very few situations in which somebody has lost OpenShift and left it at the bar. Like, that just rarely ever happens. So now if these things are not installed locally, then the natural next question is, well, what about my ID? My ID's on my machine. Like, so I still need my machine for that, right? Maybe. I mean, certainly there are folks in the room probably today that use VI and Emacs and have forever, and will probably continue to use VI and Emacs forever. But increasingly, web IDEs, I believe, will be seen as the default. Now, I may be slightly biased here. Let's be transparent. I am the project lead for the open source Eclipse Che project, so that is itself a web IDE and a containerized IDE. And so I may have a slight bias. But I'm not alone in this, actually. Within Red Hat, within the DevTools team, there is kind of a broad belief that this will happen. And again, to draw a parallel, this is a lot like the move from Microsoft Word to Google Docs. And if we think about that, there's a lot of ways that it's like that, and that has its own set of far-reaching impacts. When Google Docs first appeared, and I was playing with it, the first thing most people said was, yeah, but it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that, it doesn't do the other. Microsoft Word does all those things. Yeah, you're right. It still doesn't do all the stuff that Microsoft Word does. But it's used by tons of people. Why did that happen? Why did they choose to go to a less functional product when they had a more functional one at their fingertips? And the answer is, of course, collaboration. It's teamwork. It's interaction. That was the killer thing that Google Docs brought. And it's interesting because if you remember, when we had only Microsoft Word, how often did you collaborate on a document? Almost never, because it was brutally painful. And so almost every doc was authored by me, written entirely by me, and then sent out by me. And his was by him, and hers was by her. There was not very little collaboration. If there's collaboration, I would walk over and say, hey, what do you think of my document? Good, I'm going to make those changes now. Now that Google Docs is available to us, the thing that I find fascinating is the way that it has changed how we work. There are very few documents now that I start, I fully author, and I complete alone. Almost every doc I start, somebody gets added to it. Now, they don't always contribute. They don't always do very much with it. But now the default in my mind is, why wouldn't I open this up? Why wouldn't I make this a collaborative workspace? It's so easy. And I might as well suck in the brain power of everybody around me. Coding should be the same way. As much as we love to code and love to teach ourselves and get better ourselves, and we should always do that, and we will always do that, the reality is we're in a team. We're in an organization. And there are other smart people around us. And we should always want to suck their brains into our code. That's just goodness. Today, that's really not very easy. I mean, you can do it kinda through Git, but even then, it's kludgy, let's say, to be kind. The possibilities of interactive and collaborative coding, I think, are only just starting to be seen. And by this, I don't, by the way, mean pair programming, which is a whole different thing. I'm thinking more in a fluid fashion, the way we do, like I said, with Google Docs. So we talked about the fact that most applications will be written with a mix of languages. Polyglot is the new norm, I said earlier. One of the things that's different, though, is that today, polyglot means polytool. The assumption has been that in order to have expertise in my IDE, for example, on Java, it needs to be a Java IDE. And then if I'm going to do development in Python, then I need to get a Python IDE, and so on and so forth. Now, that's not because I like using multiple tools to do largely the same job. It's because I need the expert capabilities that each of those IDEs has for that particular language. But if I could get the same set of expert capabilities all in one IDE, well, that's obviously better. I don't want to have to learn 3 different interfaces to do 3 different languages, but I'm not willing to give up the expertise of those 3 different tools until I can get them all in one place. Now, this one, to some degree, is already starting to come true because there's something called the Language Server Protocol, which you may or may not have heard of. It was a protocol created by a combination of Microsoft, Red Hat, and CodeEnvy. The protocol basically defines a JSON interface layer around what is called a language server. The language server embeds all the necessary intelligence to do the autocomplete and the syntax checking and the jump to definition and the Javadoc style stuff and all the things that you want to be able to do with your IDE, all the things that make a Java IDE different than a Python IDE, right? Those things now get pulled out of the IDE and put into a language server. That language server, because it has that protocol agnostic wrapper around it, can now be plugged into any number of different IDEs. So Eclipse Chase supports the LSP, VS Code supports the LSP, the classic Eclipse Desktop IDE supports the LSP, and there's more adding their support kind of with each passing month. The thing that's fascinating about this, and I got kind of like a really clear moment of like aha with this one, because about, I think it's probably about a year ago, no, more than a year ago, I guess we've almost probably closer to 2 years ago, Eclipse Che had very good support for Java, very good support for JavaScript, and then okay support for a bunch of other languages, including like kind of meh support for PHP. Language Server Protocol comes out, and if you know PHP, you probably know Zend, because Zend makes the best PHP developer environment. They built a language server, and we plugged that language server into Che during the course of 1 2-week sprint. And so in the course of 2 weeks, we went from having like pretty poor PHP support to instantly having like everything a PHP developer would want in their IDE. And the response was incredible, I mean, because it blew people's minds. They're like, hold on a second, you just took a 2-week sprint and you went from nothing to like by far the best PHP IDE in the web? Really? How does that work? And the answer was we did very little. Zend built a language server, we just plugged it in. So now you plug in all these language servers and suddenly you can have an IDE which has all that intelligence and where you switch languages without needing to switch the IDE. And that to me is a huge, again, kind of efficiency gain. You think of being able to get the muscle memory for a single IDE, but be able to do it for any language. I think that's fantastic. Now, over the past 10 years, let's say, there's been an increasing focus on UX, user experience. And companies have found UX engineers, and we're thinking a lot more about what's the user experience of our product, and that's an awesome thing. The only downside is that UX so far is really a corollary for UI. UX designers that I've met almost universally focus on just the UI of an app. But increasingly, apps are being judged for the quality of their API, the kind of intuitiveness of their API, and how good is their CLI? Can I learn the CLI quickly? Does it allow me to do things, independent of the UI? So these non-UI entry points into applications are very, very important to developers. There are whole projects that have kind of succeeded or failed based on how good their CLI is, and how clean and well represented their API is. So this is something that we're going to need to put a lot more effort into. And it's going to be a challenge for the developer, but it's going to be a bigger challenge, I think, for the UX folks. So if there are any UX people in the room, my advice to you is start to learn a little bit about CLIs. Think about CLIs. Think about APIs. Because a well-crafted one can make a huge difference. We spent an enormous amount of time with Eclipse Che on its API and making that clear and easy to read and rich and broad. And we spent an enormous amount of time on, well, this is more in CodeEnvy, I guess, in the CodeEnvy CLI to make sure that it was clear to people, that it guided a user through what they needed to do with that product from the command line. And we got tons of compliments on both. It was actually one of the more frequent kind of newbie compliments we would get is, hey, checked out your project, super cool, love that CLI, or I can't believe how much you can do with the API and it's so well laid out, thank you. These things really helped propel the growth of our project. And I think if we'd had a crappy CLI and a useless API, I don't think Che would be where it is now, which is a huge, huge project. End-to-end visibility is going to be mandated across more industries. This one's interesting. So when I'm talking end-to-end visibility here, I'm not talking like monitoring, I'm not talking Istio. What I'm talking about here is the visibility of how a piece of code got into production and walking that back from it's in production to how did it get to be, let's say it's a containerized app. How did that container get built? Where was it built? When was it built? Who kicked off that build? Okay. Where did that build pull from in terms of the source code repo? Okay. Who made the change in the source code repo that triggered that? All right. Where did that change come from? And who demanded that that change be made through some kind of work tracking system? It's about being able to trace that lineage from idea through to implementation. And I think this is hugely important. So there's some regulated industries that are already seeing this. Financial, healthcare, aspects of government and security already see this and are already familiar with them. But it is going to get much, much broader. Because one of the other things I didn't talk about so much that has changed, that we all know, is the world has become a much more technological place. And that is fantastic, but that is dangerous. A self-driving car with a bug can kill you, okay? My IDE can't kill you. Doesn't matter how many bugs I put in it, it's not gonna kill you. Unless you put it on a really, really heavy computer and drop it on your head, but don't do that. You've got locks on your door. You go to Home Depot and you can buy a lock, which can be electronically locked and unlocked from your phone. Super convenient, unless it gets hacked, and then somebody comes into your house who shouldn't be there. You've got all sorts of capabilities now, and there's more and more coming all the time, that we are putting people potentially at risk with our bugs. Now, governments have always lagged behind technology. So far, there is no governmental regulation for this stuff. But one of the things I've noticed, just even on social media, is a lot more calls from, I think, our own developer community saying, we need to start holding ourselves to a higher standard. Doctors have the Hippocratic Oath. As developers, as we move into this new world where our mistakes can threaten people's lives, we need to start holding ourselves to a higher standard. We need to have some kind of oath about, I'm going to test the crap out of this because I don't want somebody to die. It's not okay to just skip a test. So this, to me, is something that is going to be partly a culture change, okay? It's going to be a process change, but it's going to need tooling changes as well. The tooling has to be able to expose and bring this data up to us so that we can better see it, so we can better react to it, and so we can better proact with it. It's not a word, but you get what I mean. And this leads kind of to the very last of the 10, which is data-driven and machine-driven development. Now, here, yeah, maybe eventually we're talking about robots, coding robots. That's not so much what I'm focused on right now. Right now, to me, this is about bringing data together in a way and exposing it smoothly up to the developers so that we can make smarter decisions with a better wealth of experience behind us. Okay? In the same way that we want to collaborate with our team, we want to have the knowledge of millions of other developers at our fingertips. So, for example, some of our products already pull from all the projects on GitHub, all the projects at Maven Central, dependencies rather on Maven Central. And all that data is brought in and used to highlight, for a developer, the moment that a security vulnerability is found in a dependent package, for example. That's helpful. I shouldn't need to wait until something lands in production to find out that or goes through production scanning to find out that there's a security vulnerability. I should get an alert in my IDE that says, hey, by the way, the package you just added now with that import statement, it has a CVE in it. Don't do that. That's super helpful. Licenses, another great example. When today, again, old times, like my 7-year-old always refers to old times as the 1980s. Did that happen before the 1980s? I'm like, it's not that long ago, relax. But yes, sorry, where was I? Before, apps had a fairly small number of dependencies, really, when you look at it. Now, it's easy to accidentally add tens or sometimes hundreds of dependencies into your app. When you talk about the dependency and then the dependencies dependency and those dependencies, and you walk that chain all the way down, which almost nobody does because it's incredibly tedious. But for a machine to do it, it's pretty easy. And so you want to be able to say to people, okay, the license that you have on your source code now is fairly, let's say, unrestricted. But that package you just imported actually has, as one of its many dependencies, a package with a very restrictive license. Now you're in trouble. You got to highlight that. You got to figure out a way around that, because that's not okay. These are the kind of things that, again, we don't have a good way to deal with this really today as we are coding, which is when we really should be dealing with them, not after they've been, been merged already into the code base and gone through CI and all that kind of stuff. I think this is a little bit like, as a way to kind of unleash the creativity of the developer. When I have a large number of friends who are not developers, and I find that universally across them, they look at development, software development, as some kind of mathematical discipline. And obviously there's a mathematical element to it, but that's not how I see it. I see developers as highly creative people. I think there's actually a greater similarity between a developer, a writer, a painter, than there is, between a developer and some other super technical discipline, bridge builder. There's a great deal of creativity in what we do. The problem that I see is that there's a ton of drudgery we need to do as part of being creative. And that, I think, is a shame. When you go to any of the huge museums and you see these giant works of art that were painted in like the 1700s, 1800s, they'll have one artist's name underneath them. They were not painted by one artist. There was an artist and 12 apprentices. And the apprentices did all the crummy painting of the sky blue before the artist went in and made the clouds look beautiful. That's okay. That's kind of the way the code should be too, except that we probably don't want to be carrying software interns with us wherever we go in like a little posse. We should just have machine learning that says, hey, can I fill in all this crummy drudgery for you so you can focus on the part that's creative and interesting and compelling? Think of how much more great software we'd have if you could use 100% of your brain on the cool creative stuff instead of 50%. So that's the kind of 10 big things that we think of, kind of pulling them all together. This is what we use as kind of our guiding lights as we're looking for where are we going to take our products in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And because we've been looking at this already, we've already made significant changes to our portfolio. And our focus is really about helping people create modern apps in modern teams with modern processes. Teams is very important. And how we do that in a way which is container-based and cloud-based, because again, we believe that's where things are going. And so there's really 3 main parts of the portfolio, and this is kind of how I break it down in my head with my team. Desktop tools, container-native tools, and SaaS tools. Some of the example products that we have underneath. Dev Studio, desktop tool, OpenShift Do, which is our new CLI, which just actually was released here at Summit into Tech Preview. That's the developer-focused CLI for OpenShift. If you haven't checked it out, please do. It's really quite cool. Eclipse Che, my personal favorite, of course. And the SaaS tool is OpenShift IO, which is something you can actually come and see all these things, in fact, at the DevZone booth, which I'd encourage you to do. And as we look at this and we kind of start mapping some of these things in, and I'm not going to map them all in because it'll take too long, but the polyglot language support is something that we do across the whole thing. In fact, Dev Studio, our desktop IDE based on the Eclipse desktop IDE, recently was expanded with the Red Hat OpenShift application runtimes for Vertex and Spring Boot and Wildfly. And so now it's starting to get more polyglot itself. Development done in containers really kind of starts with OpenShift Do and Eclipse Che, the container development kit, et cetera, and then moves forward through OpenShift IO. When you get into Che now, you start to get the additional benefits of reducing workspace setup and management time, because now my developer workspace, instead of being something I install locally and which is not transferable, becomes something which is containerized by default and automatically inside Kubernetes or OpenShift. And that makes it very easy for me to replicate it. It makes it easy for me to hand it off to somebody else, et cetera. The analytics actually begins to filter in as well. If you, again, come to the dev zone, we can kind of show you examples of this, but in OpenShift IO and Eclipse Che, of what I talked about. CVEs are called out. Licenses are called out. If you're using a package, it looks at the context of all your packages and compares it to all the other projects on GitHub and says, what other projects on GitHub use similar packages? And where have you diverged from what would be kind of the average? So maybe you're using a web auth package. We can look at GitHub and say, hey, did you know that 95% of apps that are Vertex, that run in OpenShift, that use this technology set and these dependencies, use this other web auth package? Maybe you need to use that one. We're not saying you have to change it. Maybe you need something in that specific one. Or maybe you just read it in a blog, it sounded cool, and you dropped it in your code. And didn't realize that 95% of the world has kind of standardized on a different one. And so, again, good information to have. And then OpenShift IO, because it is focused on an end-to-end tool chain for OpenShift, which really includes Planner, coding, build, deployment to production, and analytics around it. So it's everything the team needs to build a cloud-native or container-native application. Because it's doing that, it's actually standardizing and simplifying the kind of macro cycle. So within the team, we talk actually about two different loops. We talk about what we call an inner loop, which is I code, I look at the running code, I debug it, I code, I look at the running code, I debug it, and round and round and round. And I go around that inner loop many, many times a day. Okay? So that one spins very quick, if you think of gear. Around it is another loop, which runs a little slower. That's the loop of I commit my code, then it gets built, then it goes to integration tests, then it goes to a CI system, then it gets deployed out in production, and then that kind of is the slower moving outer loop. So you got fast moving inner loop, slower moving outer loop. I can't make my hands do that, but you get the idea. And that's really what we're trying to do with OpenShift IO is smooth out that outer loop. Che is focused very much on the inner loop. Well, so is Dev Studio. Some of the other things we're going to do going forward, and this is something we also announced here at Summit, was we're going to productize Eclipse Che. So Eclipse Che is an open source project. Red Hat will be creating a package of it, and we'll be supporting it through our standard customer support channels. And that's important because Eclipse Che gets deployed into your OpenShift environment, into your OpenShift cluster, and gets used by all your developers at the same time. And so you want to have support for that. That becomes a pretty critical tool to you. It's going to make your developers more efficient, but you've got to make sure you've got the weight of Red Hat behind it. We'll add serverless functions to our IDEs. So this has just started. And in fact, if you were in the keynote this morning, you will have seen Eclipse Che, and you will have seen OpenWhisk serverless functions being developed in it. Now, that was, I'll be perfectly honest with you, kind of prototypey stuff for a really cool demo. But it shows where we're going, and that will be productized as well. The serverless functions, as I've talked about, are a big focus for us. We're going to be adding more enterprise features to OpenShift IO. So today, it is a SaaS, and it works very well for Java Maven projects that are hosted on GitHub. But not a lot of enterprises host their stuff on GitHub. So we're going to be adding support for private repositories, private registries. We're going to be adding more languages to it and expanding it and expanding it and expanding it because it really fits with our vision that a team, neither an individual nor a team, should need to install and configure software in order to build or contribute to their project. Right? They should just be able to jump in and start coding. Just jump in and start being productive. So we're going to keep expanding it for that. And we're going to add analytics to all of our developer tools. Like I said, we've already started this. We've got that in OpenShift IO. It's in Che. It's in Dev Studio. And it's going to keep expanding and expanding. Not just adding it at all, but then, of course, adding what kind of analytics and the kind of data that we can roll up to developers. That one's exciting. But most importantly, and this is what I'll wrap up with, we're going to continue to lead. We're going to continue and innovate the open source way, because we all believe very strongly that that is what is going to drive this engine of change. It is what has driven the engine of change, from my opinion, thus far, and it's going to continue to do so. And that's what is exciting about being at Red Hat, is to be able to partake in that at the community level and at the product level. All right, I think that is it, folks. Thank you very much.